So this morning, if you went to the 8 o'clock service, you kind of know where I'm going with this, which is why I'm going to spend hopefully less time talking and more time listening to our conversation. Before we begin, we've talked about this before, about how God isn't mentioned directly in the book of Esther. It's the only book of the Bible where God is not mentioned, or many people think not even alluded to. Some people see possible allusions to what God is doing. I addressed those in the message this morning, but you don't have to believe the same thing I do. That's one thing that I'm always clear on. If you disagree, then that's good. I just want you to think about why you disagree and how you disagree. I want you to come to your own conclusions for your life of faith. There are what some people believe are possible allusions to God. There's the use of sackcloth and ashes. There is something that Jewish people now call the fast of Esther. And then there are coincidences all throughout the story, throughout the whole saga of Esther. And so I'd like to start by reading the 2 chapters for today. That's Esther chapters 4 and 5. And as I'm reading, I want you to, as you hear this story, I want you to think about, what's happening here? Why is it happening? Are there parts of the story that are surprising to you, confusing to you? Do you feel drawn to parts of this story? What do you want to know more about? Those are the questions that I begin my sermon reflection. I begin my preparation for sermons by asking questions like these. And so I want to hear I want to hear what's going on with you when you hear this part of the story. So this is chapters 4 and 5. So where we are at this point, Mordecai works in the king's gate, which is actually, he functions as kind of the king's eyes and ears in the city of Susa. He keeps an eye out for issues and threats. He sends them up the government ladder. He is Esther's foster father. Esther has been selected by King Xerxes to be the new queen. Being the queen, though, is not it's not a solidified position, which is to say, if you have been crowned, you can be stripped of your crown, so you can lose your title. In the previous chapter, Haman, who was a minor government official who rises to power, feels disrespected by Mordecai. Mordecai will not bow to Haman. And so Haman hatches a plot to eliminate all the Jews. He thought it was beneath himself to only punish Mordecai. So he wants all the Jews gone. He convinces the king to do this, partly with an explanation, partly with a bribe. And so this is where we are now. So this is chapters 4 and 5. When Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and poured ashes on himself. He went throughout the city, crying out loudly and bitterly, until he reached the king's gate. You cannot enter the king's gate wearing sackcloth. And in every province that the royal declaration reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, fasting, crying, wailing, and the masses laid in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's maidens and eunuchs came and informed her, the queen was filled with dread. She sent a set of clothes to Mordecai so that he would remove his sackcloth, but he refused. After this, Esther summoned Hatak, one of the king's eunuchs appointed to serve her, and sent him to Mordecai to learn what this was all about. Hatak went out to Mordecai in the city square in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and about the money that Haman had offered to pay the king for the right to destroy the Jews. He also gave him the written text of the royal declaration that was proclaimed in Susa for their destruction. He told him to show it to Esther and to instruct her to go to the king, to appeal to him, and to plead with him on behalf of her people. When Hatak delivered the message to Esther, she told him to take her reply. All the aristocracy and the officials of the king's provinces know that if any person enters the king's presence in the royal quarters without being summoned, they will be put to death. The only exception is if the king extends the golden scepter. Then they may live. But I have not been summoned to visit the king for 30 days now. When Mordecai was told what Esther had said, he sent another message. Do not imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the royal palace. On the contrary, if you keep quiet, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, but you and your family line will die out. And who knows, perhaps you have attained to royal status for just such a crisis. Then Esther sent back to Mordecai, Go and gather all the Jews who live in Susa and fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days and nights. My maidens and I will observe the same fast. Then I will go to the king, even though I defy the law. If I die, I die. Mordecai went throughout the city and did as Esther had commanded. On the 3rd day, Esther put on royal garments and stood in the inner courtyard of the palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne in the royal quarters facing the entrance. It happened that when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the courtyard, she won his favor. The king extended the golden scepter he was holding, and Esther approached and touched the tip. The king said, What is troubling you, Queen Esther? What is your request? I would grant you even half of my kingdom. And Esther said, Should it so please the king, let the king and Haman come today to the feast which I have prepared for him. The king said, Bring Haman quickly so that we do Esther's bidding. So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. During the wine course, the king said to Esther, What is your wish? It will be granted to you. And what is your request? I would grant you even half of my kingdom. And Esther replied, My wish and my request. If I have found favor in the king's eyes, and should it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast I shall prepare for them. And tomorrow I will do as the king has said. So Haman went out in merry and in good spirits. But when he saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and Mordecai did not rise or even stir, Haman was filled with wrath against him. But Haman controlled himself, went home, and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman told them about his great wealth and his many sons and all the ways in which the king had promoted him and advanced him above all the officials and servants of the king. What is more, said Haman, Queen Esther gave a feast, and besides the king she invited nobody but me. And tomorrow too I am invited by her along with the king. Yet all this means nothing to me, so long as I must see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the king's gate. And his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, Have a stake made, 75 feet high, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai impaled on it. then you can go merrily with the king to the feast. Haman was pleased with the idea, and he had the stake put up. So, what are your do you have first impressions of these couple chapters?
So, we missed last week, but what's interesting to me is the king's edict to kill all the Jews on behalf of Haman. Mm-hmm. They gave them a 12-month warning. The edict went out, but they weren't going to do anything for a year.
Yeah.
And so everybody's in sackcloth and mourning. And I thought typically when you're in sackcloth and mourning for the Jews, it was a sign of repentance.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, God is in the book of Esther.
Okay.
Ways. But it's interesting because everybody's, I think, right? I don't know, but I think they're repenting. But it's not like they're taking up arms, or it's not like they're fleeing. It seems like they're staying put and trying to figure out what is the will of God here.
Yeah.
So that's my initial take.
Yeah, it's interesting when you point out sackcloth and ashes, because from the Jewish perspective, that is typically, that's typically what you get with sackcloth and ashes. Other peoples and other societies also did that. But it wasn't necessarily, it could have been to their God, it could have simply been a sign of mourning. And so you're right, Pete. It leaves it ambiguous, because I wasn't going to go here into the weeds, but I will for a moment. One of the things about this story is we're also not quite sure how much the Persian Jews know about Jewish law and Jewish custom. Like, Esther is Mordecai's uncle's daughter. So she may be about his age, or younger. According to Jewish law, he could have married her. The fact that he doesn't, some people think that's supposed to be a surprise in the story. That he chose not to marry her, because in that culture, the question would be, well, why not? So it's kind of left open as to what they do to follow Jewish tradition and custom, and how Persianized are these people. And so I think you really hit on something there, because that is, there are scholars who say, this is a definite sign that, that they know, God is present because of these things they're doing. But then some say, well, but what is ultimately, what's their goal? Is it a Persian thing to cover yourself in sackcloth and ashes, or is this a Jewish thing? Because it's because of the place. It's open-ended, and it's interesting because some of it is. I do kind of want to. I'm going to try to get us in this direction, but if you don't want it, that's okay. Push back. The question of where are the points where we might see God more than in other places. And I kind of raised some questions about that in the message, so if you were already here earlier, you can tell me if you disagree with me. At 10:30, you'll have to tell me that afterwards.
Well, I think that sort of the challenge that Mordecai sends through Hatak back to Esther
Mm-hmm.
to take a stand.
Mm.
You
Mm-hmm.
know, where is your faith, Esther? And is she going to rise to the occasion? And it's obviously she does. It's a plan of the banquet. She's going to do something.
Mm.
So,
And I think it's interesting in this conversation that Mordecai and Esther have through Hatak. This is the first time in the story that Esther actually speaks. Up until now, Esther's been this mostly passive, she's been a passive person, almost an object at the beginning of the story, because the king just kind of collects her and adds her to his collection. She's his favorite, so she becomes the queen. But we don't hear from her or her motivations or her desires until this moment. And is that, what prompts that speaking up? What prompts that choice to take on an active role when she's been so passive before? I think that's a real possibility.
Well,
I just have a point of clarification.
Yeah.
King Ahasuerus, that's the Bible.
Or Xerxes, yeah.
That's pronounced Xerxes?
Well, it depends on which translation you have.
So it's the same.
It can be,
Xerxes, X-E-R.
mhm.
it can be Ahasuerus, it can be Artaxerxes, it can be Xerxes.
Okay, so that's just my translation. I'm
And
very
that's-
confused by that.
Well,
It didn't take much, it doesn't
it's-
take much.
It's a transliteration from Hebrew versus a translation.
Okay.
And so, Xerxes for the sake of, I prefer Xerxes for the sake of simplicity, but we're talking literally taking the Hebrew word and going letter by letter and spelling it out, or we're going by the translation of that name.
I think this was. I think this was.
Pete, I wanted to make sure you didn't get
I've
missed.
already said enough. I didn't-
No, you can. You got it.
It's also interesting, towards the end of her first speech, she says, "But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." So she might feel like, hey, I've been going to the king a lot over the last, 5 years, doing different things. But maybe there's this hesitancy, maybe I'm starting to fall out of favor. Because I don't know why they would put in, but 30 days have passed since I last saw the king.
Yeah.
I might not be as tight with him as I used to be.
Yeah. Is there like an indifference on the part of the king? Or has he kind of, would he much rather be the king by himself? Is the queen just somebody who gets in the way? Especially after, in chapter 1, the former queen disagrees with, she disobeys a command, and so he casts her out. Is this kind of a, well, I guess, the queen, can she really be trusted? Is she, how close to the vest is he? Does he keep his cards?
Because I think, if I did the math right, she's been queen now for about 5 years.
I
So
think you're right. Wow, nice.
it'll be interesting.
Yeah, because 5 years is 5 years should be enough time to build up at least some sort of relationship. But yeah, you make a really good point. Is that if I'm kind of on the outs with the king, then that really raises the stakes. Yeah.
mentioned last week, you know, why didn't they flee? Because the Jews did flee when they were being persecuted, if they could. They had a whole year to prepare and leave. And so I'm left wondering about that. If they knew that they were going to be persecuted yet again, or did they have a plan of some sort? We don't know.
That's a very good question, and that ties into that that phrase from Mordecai, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, from another place. And so was there a, maybe outside the city, are we making quiet preparations in case that relief somehow doesn't come? Is that is there a sense of faith or confidence that somebody will step up and stop this thing, that events will happen that will put a stop to it?
Does he believe God is going to intervene?
That's an open question. So what do you think about this kind of monologue from Mordecai? It's interesting. Hatak has he's still delivering the messages, but he kind of fades out of the story. It's like Mordecai and Esther are talking to each other directly. But what do you think of that? Do not imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the royal palace. Is this part of the king has not proven himself to be a very he can be a strong leader when somebody suggests strong things, but otherwise, is she imagining maybe the king will shrug his shoulders and say, well, that's the law. Somebody made it the law, maybe not remembering that it was actually him who made it the law.
Yeah, I think he was just setting out the facts, because just because you're queen doesn't mean you're not dispensable, as history had proven out with Queen Vashti. So I think he was just stating the facts.
Don't forget about. Don't forget, you're not the first queen this guy has had.
Right.
He can just swap you out with somebody else, and he won't. Apparently, he's relatively unaffected.
Well, we don't know Xerxes knows she's Jewish either. There's nothing that's told us ahead of time that says he's aware of her ethnicity at all, only that she was beautiful.
Yes.
So that's all he probably cared about at the time. So he's not really aware that his edict could include her as well.
Yeah, but the eunuch and Haman knew that she was Jewish because she was a relative of Mordecai.
But the king doesn't.
Okay, so then we're falling into the king is a buffoon.
That's right. That's the whole point.
Logic
He's
right.
not aware of his own stupidity.
Yeah,
Part of the sermon.
But Haman is, so don't think you're protected just because. If this guy's out to, essentially, I think sometimes you kind of wonder if he's trying to create a coup to take over the kingdom. And he's aware of just how easy it is to play Xerxes. So let me tell you how handsome you are and how rich you are, and I have you eating out of my hands.
And when we get toward the end of the story, where we see some of the reversals, that will actually be something that the king almost says straight out. Is are you, Haman, trying to, are you trying to take my place? Are you trying to edge me out? Which is interesting. It leads to the only decision the king makes on his own.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. And that, I feel like that raises another good point for the Jewish people. It doesn't seem like there's anything that Esther does that identifies her as Jewish. If the king is buffoonish and doesn't really pay attention, but we know the only reason Haman knows that Mordecai is a Jew is because Mordecai told some other people who told him. And we only know that Esther is a Jew because she's related to Mordecai. And so that raises another question about, how Persian are you, how Jewish are you, if you can't be outwardly identified? And what does that do about the king's decree to massacre the Jews? Is that also potentially a way of weeding out, renounce being Jewish, or if your neighbors don't know that you're Jewish, keep it a secret? It could potentially also be a way of trying to de-Judaize all the Jews in this vast empire.
Or force them underground.
Yeah, or force them underground. Like in Spain, there was a the conversos when in 1492 when they expelled all the Jewish people. There was a group of Jews. Pete, you already know what I'm going to say, who converted to Christianity outwardly, but maintained their Jewish Jewish rituals and traditions in secret, so that they could. So is that perhaps something that's on the menu with, why aren't they fleeing? Because the Jewish people do have, there is in times of extreme persecution, there's an understanding that Jewish law and Jewish tradition can be suspended. The teachers of Judaism pointed to, in the book of Leviticus, it said, "These are the things you shall live by." And so the Jewish teachers said, God said you shall live by these, not die by them. And so there is an understanding that in times of extreme difficulty, these are not considered displeasing to God, because God desires that you live. And so maybe that's in the cards too. Maybe that's why we're not hearing about Jewish people furiously packing their bags and getting out.
But did they have their own Jewish neighborhood that they lived in, or had they been there long enough that they kind of intermingled and they had storefronts next to the Persian guy, or I don't know how long they were in. When I think of people being in exile, you're assuming they're in their own quarters.
Mm-hmm.
And that's probably my assumption based on the Joseph story, and his people come and or in Goshen, they don't disperse through Egypt. And I'm assuming if you're hauled off to captivity, you're in a place.
Yeah.
But maybe not. Maybe if they're going all through, Mordecai's going all over the districts, that would tend to make you think they're dispersed. They've been there long enough that they now have their businesses, their shops, their connections outside of just their own Jewish community. Do we know how long they were there?
We know that Mordecai's great-grandfather was part of the exile. And so, depending on the age of his parents, it could have been 60 years. It could have been longer if his father, as was sometimes the tradition, married older to a younger woman. So it's been at least 60 years.
So 3 generations.
Mm-hmm.
So what can happen in 3 generations of
Yeah,
people being there?
you
So
you
that's a possibility.
you might end up with dispersal, but you might end up with, you can find places. When I lived in Boston, there were areas that were very Italian. There were places that were very Irish. And so those quarters still remained, and that was after, that's after over 100 years. So that's entirely possible. Maybe that's a whole other thing. They don't, they just know where to find the Jewish people. They don't have to knock door to door and, try to figure out if they're Jewish or not. They know they're planning exactly where to land. That's a really good point.
Regarding the fasting,
Mm-hmm.
as I understand it, fasting is, a way of purification. I'm sure that's how the Jews chose to fast, purification, becoming closer to God. So it seems like Esther wanted fasting on both sides, in her home house and in the Jewish people to fast before this banquet. So I think that's putting trust in God, And then her last comment to Mordecai or to Hatak was, I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So just having faith that this is the walk I have to take.
And fasting didn't mean necessarily 24-hour fasting. Fasting could be from sunup to sundown.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a little different than
Okay.
what we might think of fasting today. If you look at other cultures at that time, fasting was a sunup to sundown.
But it's some kind of a
It's,
sacrifice.
yeah, it's,
And
you're right.
atonement or,
Right. But I know we often think of fasting as 24 hours.
Mm.
That is not always not always the case with the Middle East. We don't know either way, but I would presume, based on what we know of other cultures now, of the Middle East, it's really a sunup to sundown, refrain from eating and drinking.
Yeah, and I mean, even that raises a few extra questions, because if Esther is going to get all dressed up to go see the king, after fasting for 3 days, is she really going to give the desired effect of royalty entering? How is she going to feel and look after 3 days of fasting? There's also the other issue that because of the timing of the story, part of that fast runs over the Passover, which would have been extremely unusual to, that is something that was definitely instituted by God as a perpetual remembrance. And so this fast, because of the timing of the story, would run over the Passover. And so is that one of these signs that the Jews are Persianized and they don't observe the Passover? Is that because the situation is so grave that the need to fast then takes priority over the Passover? That raises questions too about what's going on in this fast.
it also kind of gives clues to her faith,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
practice that the Jews would partake in.
Mm-hmm. And the Jewish people still do. They call it the Fast of Esther, it's one day and not 3 days, but it's the day before Purim. And so it is kind of a preparation for their celebration of their deliverance from this situation.
So is that now at a different time that they celebrate than Passover?
Yes.
So they've just made it a whole separate.
They've separated it out. Now it's actually connected to the date of the date that they were supposed to be slaughtered, and instead were vindicated before their enemies. So the observance is there rather than at the moment that, yes. Yeah. So tell me more about this king. What's the king up to in this part of the story?
Same thing he's always been up to, pretty patient.
Whatever you want.
Yep.
You can have half my kingdom.
Yeah, and that's that's a common turn of phrase. That's something that in the New Testament, that's what Herod says when his stepdaughter demands the head of John the Baptist. So that's kind of a common phrase, but it's a common phrase of willingness to give away what you have as a sign of your largesse. I have so much that I can give you half of it, and I can still be who I am.
But he can't give her what she wants because it's a law, and you can't take back any law. Ever.
Yeah.
That's kind of odd.
Yeah, and in the background, this law thing is still hanging out. That apparently, in the world of this story, no law can be changed or removed, or how does a country function when no law can ever be changed or removed or even in a sense questioned?
Well, it happened with Daniel too.
Mm.
The king still had to throw him in with the lions.
Yeah.
And, he couldn't walk back his law.
Mm-hmm.
So after the fact that Daniel made it through the night meant, okay, he served his punishment,
Mm-hmm.
but then, so that obviously been around for quite a long time.
Yeah. Even when the king was sorry to do it, the king did not want to put him in there, but yeah, there's this,
Even the king can't break the law.
yeah, which is really interesting given what we know about kings in that time, the king having so much power. So is this perhaps, is this a way of, I don't know how Persian belief is. I'm not up on Zoroastrianism. Is this perhaps a way of that faith trying to curtail, even the king must have limits somehow?
I think it's interesting that Esther invited the king and Haman.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, because Haman's the one who dreamed up the whole decree, so you would think you'd want to get the king alone to convince him, but she doesn't do that. She brings in the king and Haman.
Yeah, that is.
Which works out beautifully in the end, but I wouldn't think that would be my first inclination.
Or even in this moment, now that the king has, invited her to enter the palace and says, "What is it that you want?" this is also a moment when she could say, hey, remember that Haman guy? He's got some plans that I really need some help with. But then there's also, the king lets everybody make decisions for him. And so, even though Haman was the one who came up with the order, it's signed in the king's name, and it's sealed with the king's ring. And so, in a sense, even though the king did not come up with this, even though he was bribed and coaxed, technically this is the king's law. Does that add another wrinkle to this whole thing? Because to say something to the king is to also kind of tell the king that he's a dupe. That you let somebody trick you into doing this, or you allowed yourself to be bamboozled into doing this. Now, I find the king to be he's a very interesting character. In some ways he's really one-sided, but in some ways he's pretty complex. His involvement in the story is difficult. In the next chapter he'll basically be the comic relief, but in this chapter it is a serious issue. Pete, you make a great point. Esther has a number of things she can do here. So why the feast with him?
He's the source of the problem. You might as well have him be there with the king, so that the king can realize it's the source.
And Hammond has his ear, and she
Yeah.
doesn't really.
Okay.
Think about it, it's a male-dominant society.
Yeah.
She needs the person that really can talk in the king's ear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you mention it that way, I mean, the queen is...
Even if she doesn't like him, he has the king's ear.
Yeah, and because the queen is, the king can dismiss her at will, then it's, who do you believe? Me, your foremost official, or some girl? Which, at this point, that's still how she's seen.
That's his Achilles.
Yeah, which is something I thought about this last week, and I mentioned it in the message kind of in passing, but the king picked Esther out of supposedly all of the young virgins in the kingdom. And so the king kind of wrecked the future of his empire, didn't he? He took every single girl of marriageable age out of the provinces and
Not
out
only
of...
the best ones.
This is all.
Yeah, you had to audition.
Well, at the beginning, though, he summons all of them.
Right, I think they whittled it down.
Is it whittled down?
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Okay.
I couldn't
There
hear
were,
because it sounds like they started with all, but then they kind of went through and picked and choose and sent people back that
Okay.
didn't meet the criteria.
I don't recall that part. I'm happy to be proven
We
wrong.
get the perfumes and the cosmetic treatments,
The 12 months of...
Charm school.
Yeah, charm school.
Yeah, and 2:8, it says, when the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many girls were brought to the
Not all.
citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. So, it was probably many, but I can't believe it was all. Logistically, it doesn't work out. For an engineer's mind, it's a few.
Too many women.
Too many.
But logistically, the law thing doesn't work either. If a law can't be overturned, how do you
Right. Well,
govern an empire?
you if you omit certain things of the law, you don't wanna. It's just like today, right? I mean, there's tons of different laws on the books, but only a relative few are followed just because of the mass enormity of all of them. And then throughout the Old Testament, when kings gave laws, the kings were thought to be infallible. So if a king sends out a decree, then, it's infallible, and so that's why, it has to be, amended by another law.
So is this almost an admission that the king is very fallible? Be careful before you make a law, because it's going to stand? And this king is just enough of a putz to go ahead and just start passing laws left and right?
Well, later on, he grants another law so that the Jews can rise up and destroy any of their enemies, so it's,
Yeah, so
laws come and go, so,
But
I don't know.
But that doesn't repeal the first law. That's just another law that,
That's what you're saying.
that count,
He couldn't repeal the first one.
Yeah, you can't repeal the one that says you can kill the Jews, but you can enact the second one that says
You can find
if
out.
somebody tries to kill you as a Jew, you can go and kill them, and that's okay.
Right, you probably won't be thrown back in court.
Mhm.
But it does say all, in in chapter 2, it says, all the beautiful girls, so that.
Ah,
So they have to
okay,
meet a criteria to start with.
okay. Everybody else is,
If you're medium, you get to stay. You get to stay home, you're not good enough. So they had a criteria to start with.
okay, okay.
But I think she invited the two of them because she needed to know what Hammond was up to also.
Mm.
So that she probably could sit and listen to their conversation.
Mhm.
She couldn't be a part of it, even if it was her feast.
Yeah.
She had her own table that she would have been feasting from,
Mhm.
and could overhear their conversation. Maybe that's why she said, okay, I'm gonna listen to what you say, and then I'll make a decision later of how to approach this, because I don't really know this Hammond guy very well.
That's
So I'm sure it was part of her strategy.
That's a good point. We don't know what happened in there until the wine course. There's at least one other course, probably many, that we're not privy to that conversation. So what did they talk about? Matters of state or, it's a very good point.
But I don't believe she could have sat there and eaten with them. I don't think that was permissible.
She was probably in her own removed space.
But if she's clever, it would have been close enough to still hear.
Mm-hmm.
Or her servants would hear for her.
That's true too.
She is probably close enough because the second banquet will kind of set a scene for we'll have the choreography. So so probably close enough that action can happen between the three of them, but probably in a secondary, clearly in a secondary role.
We know the king's a drinker. That was in the first chapter.
The king does love his wine.
Yeah, so he probably talked his head off.
Yeah, so toward the end of the handout, when I wrote about authority, this is, and again, you don't have to agree with any of this. This was a gentleman named Michael Beale wrote a little bit about the seeming absence of God within the story. And so you can take this or leave it. I find his arguments compelling. That doesn't mean you have to. But I especially, we should wrap up within the next few minutes. If you go back and reread the story of Esther, I invite you to make comparisons between King Xerxes and who we believe God is, who we believe God to be, and see the comparisons and contrasts between the two, because I do think that's something that the author means to convey to us, as not mentioning God directly. There is power in this story, but in what way is power used? Because in one sense, this story is all about power. Who wields it? Who holds it, but who wields it? Not necessarily the same person.
Who manipulates it.
Yes, who manipulates it? That's a better way of putting it. Yeah. Any final words of wisdom? Questions, statements, insults, recipes?
I find it also interesting that Haman's wife is mentioned by name.
Yes.
In a couple of reasons.
Yeah.
Like her,
Mm-hmm.
his cheerleader,
Right.
his confidant.
She had some power too.
Yeah, she does have power.
She suggested the
Yeah.
steak.
Yeah, she's the one who came up with the steak idea.
It wasn't in the kitchen.
And I do think it's funny. It says, he called for his friends and his wife, and he told them about his great wealth and his many sons. Well, his wife probably already knows about the wealth and the sons. So what's he, is he trying to make himself feel better? Is he trying to remind them that, he is still, is he feeling a little insecure when he sees Mordecai? But then, the 75-foot stake, what is that, 7 stories? Everybody would be able to see Mordecai if his plan worked out. All right. Anything else this morning? And again, like I say, you don't have to agree with my message. I realize that I have a particular point of view. I usually do. But I'm more concerned that if you don't agree with it, or you say, oh, that's a little tough, I just want you to think about it. I have gained a lot from sermons that I have disagreed with, because they have spurred me to think about why I feel differently, and it's urged me to go a little bit further into some of those ideas. So I encourage you to do that if today's message feels strange to you. I invite you to mull it over and consider what's happening. Linda's already laughing.
Now we've got to go to church now.
Now you have to go to church. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate our time together.
Yeah, very good.